Please like and subscribe to this channel and press the bell icon to get new video updates.
Golden Age of High Fidelity Kits for the Masses, Heathkit and Dynakit amplifiers. Everybody all set with that? Okay, very good. Basically, there's four lines there: Golden Age of HiFi, kits for the masses, companies, and amplifiers. Golden Age, you know, that corresponds to an awful lot of other Golden Age stuff. We had Golden Age for automobiles and AM equipment and what have you. But this Golden Age of High Fidelity was the American Golden Age. So let's take a look at what is the Golden Age of High Fidelity. This will cover some history and general overview of kits during the Golden Age. And then the two companies in particular, one is Heathkit, came up and did several years worth of development on what was the D.T. Williamson design. And then Dynaco came out a little bit after that with Ed Laurent being the engineer involved, but those are the two companies. Why was it golden? Well, after World War II, we had some nice economic prosperity in this country and in Europe. There was a lot of development going on. People were getting back to work. It was creating a lot of jobs, and the jobs were creating a lot of new technologies. The business and the middle class personnel income rose, which then allowed them a lot of people to start buying more products. Television was blossoming, and people wanted good quality music as well as television. The older, larger radios that were dominant through the 20s all the way through the 40s were, you know, self-contained. They did one thing, they did it pretty well, but the fidelity wasn't up to what you could get during this Golden Age. There was a lot of development that really improved upon the fidelity. Okay, what is Golden Age of Hi-Fi? The American. We have to make sure we use the American Hi-Fi. It was after World War II. It was generally started around 1950, although a few years before then there was some development. And it lasted to about 1965, and that was when most of it was done. So it was really a 15-year period. It really started right after the war and lasted up to 1978, but by 78, it was overlapping with the transistor designs that were dominated by the Japanese predominantly. What was it? Well, this was new designs and new developments. They built upon some older designs, but it was a strong vacuum tube development. The transistors were functional at that point, but most of the designs were really done with vacuum tubes. There was really like a power amplifier war with higher power coming along and lower distortion. We had different sources. We had record players. We had AMs and FM tuners that, you know, before we had an awful lot of AM, but now we're having tuners. We got reel-to-reel tape players. We got cassette tapes. All of this stuff was being developed and improved upon during this time period. Speakers were another one where we had speakers, and they were okay, but there was more development going on. They were more complex. They were lower efficiencies than the ones that came before, and lower costs, which was another thing that came along with all of this, was a push to have more and bigger and better and lower cost. Manufacturers. There were many companies that were making audio equipment that made the transition from pre to post-war. Altec, Stromberg, and there were some other ones. So these companies were making things before World War II. Some of them helped out during the war, but then after the war, they said, hey, we got to get on this bandwagon, and we're going to get making products too, because the whole industry is really getting going. But then there was a number of new companies that came along, and they did well, like Dynaco, Audio Research, and some other ones. A lot of the new ones were really driving some of these new concepts and new ideas. Some existing companies expanded into these new opportunities, and then one of them was the Heath Company. Before World War II, Heath was a company, but it really wasn't concentrating on audio equipment. It wasn't really concentrating on high fidelity at all. They really originally started, well, you'll see more about what they started as, but they expanded into this area. What drove the development? Well, again, we talked about the large freestanding AM radios. The new designs separated the functions into discrete components, and this was actually a fairly major issue. You'd wind up with an FM tuner, you'd wind up with an AM tuner, you'd wind up with a preamplifier, a power amplifier, and a speaker. When you looked at the old radios, all of those things that they had were all put into one unit. Now what we're seeing are all separate pieces. And this allowed to isolate a problem with a component and fix only what was needed. If you had a problem with your preamp, you could pull a preamp out and work on the preamp. And everything else would just stay without having to be touched and messed around with. It allowed an upgrade to the system a piece at a time, which it carries right through until today. People talk, well, I bought a new preamp, I bought a new power amp. This was where you could get something that you wanted, and if there was another part of your system that you felt you needed to improve upon, you could then buy strictly a new piece that would upgrade that part of your system. Well, cost was always a problem then, and it still is today. And kits were something that was like, hey, why don't we make a kit? Because this could save on labor costs. There was no low-cost suppliers. We did not have China making everything for us after World War II. So we either had to say, go ahead, Stromberg Carlson, make it at your plant here in Rochester, or somebody would have to say, hey, I can buy a kit. It would have the same parts in it, it roughly the same idea, but I could put that together at my own bench, and I could save all that money from just putting it together as a kit. So, I went too fast here, back up. Amplifiers. We could discuss all kinds of different components today, but it would take a very long time because I'm very long-winded. And we only really want to talk about two companies because we could talk about a whole bunch of companies. So we want to really talk about amplifiers. And at that point, they made mono amplifiers to begin with. And then later in the Golden Age, everything blossomed out and started making stereo amplifiers. Okay, overall amplifier designs. The early radios used single-ended designs. They used large base tubes, interstage transformers, directly heated output tubes. Many speakers were field coil. These designs were limited in power output and were considered to be expensive for the average consumer. So new designs were needed, and the industry really started looking into it. So they come out with miniature tubes. So the things could be smaller, saved on space, cost, power. And a whole group of new power output tubes were developed using pentode designs. Both, well, we're going to get into some of the types of designs, but they basically, you could get more power out of it, and the price was reasonable. So now, one of the fun things that you talk to high-end audio guys now, a lot of them like the original stuff from way back. But during the golden age of hi-fi, there was an awful lot of push to go to higher power and using these pentode designs. One of the new design things that they came up with were ultralinear output transformers, and that was done in the 50s, if I'm not mistaken, but it might have, the concepts might have been around before the war, but it was really only put into production until into the 50s. Kits for the masses. The masses wanted a lower cost method of obtaining quality audio. If you were rich, you could always go out and buy the very best stuff. But a lot of people said, hey, I want something better, but I really want to make it something I could afford, so the kits were a good idea. So many of the manufacturers decided that was a good idea, that they would do it. Many of the manufacturers would provide a finished product, and they would also provide a kit form for the same product. You could get really a state-of-the-art assembly and troubleshooting manuals. I'm sorry, that the manual would really create a way of making a state-of-the-art product. Some of the manuals that were put into place have not really been duplicated by today's standards. If you bought anything recently, particularly out of China, and tried to read the user manual, you just wind up throwing it in the garbage because it's really not very helpful. Whereas some of these manuals back in the golden age of hi-fi were, step by step, you put the amp completely together, you work it backwards, you can take it completely apart. They were really good manuals. And the sale of these lower cost kits really drove the industry all the way through the golden age of hi-fi. Heathkit. Heathkit was originally an airplane company, and then it got purchased and was renamed by E.B. Heath. And unfortunately, he died in a plane crash in 1931. But they wound up going through World War II with some new leadership. And after World War II, they were looking around for what to get into and decided the electronics industry was a good idea. At that point, they bought a lot of surplus wartime electronic parts because the military had made a ton of them. And at that point, Heathkit started making different products with electronics. And the first one was that oscilloscope, which we have that one at the museum, which is the 01 oscilloscope. Pretty nice. Heath went on to produce dozens of products that were hi-fi, as well as all kinds of televisions and tape players and speakers and everything else. They just got into all kinds of different products. But we're not going to cover all of those. I'm not going to read all of this, but they really did a pretty good job for a long time of making great kits and making great products and letting the consumer put them all together. All right, I had a handout when I did this originally. We're not going to hand out anything tonight, obviously, but Heathkit had made a huge number of audio products. I do have that handout. It's probably got 100 items, maybe more, that Heathkit made all through their history, and they made a lot of stuff. But they originally made monophonic equipment in the early days of the golden age of hi-fi. Record players, tape players, FM tuners, AM tuners, preamps, power amps, speakers, and then later on they added stereo versions, upgraded, but still stereo versions. At the bottom here, there's a comment about Chuck Penson's book. If anybody's really interested in Heathkit and the history of Heathkit and some of the really wonderful things that Heathkit put together, Chuck Penson has written a book. I think he's actually got a couple books on this, on the Heathkit company and all of the products they put out. Highly recommended that if you're interested, go look up Chuck Penson and look at what he developed. Great. I've read through it a little bit. I haven't really analyzed all his work, but he did a great job. Heathkit preamps, just a quick comment on it. They originally had the WAP1, which was the first mono one, and later on the WAP2. They used an umbilical cord that plugged into the power amplifier, and it used the power supply from the amp to power the preamp. You're going to see later Dynaco did the same thing. Some of the other vendors did something very similar. That fell out of vogue very quickly because the power amplifiers, you know, if you pushed them hard, the B plus voltage would sag, which then affected the power supply of the preamp. And that was a no-no. That really started to make things not sound good. So Heathkit did this with their preamps and others did too. And ultimately it was abandoned, that whole concept. All right. DT Williamson designs. These are the first of the power amps. These are the ones that are most noted in the hi-fi world as being the Heathkit amps that you would really want to try and pick up, use, and enjoy. There were a total of 7 variations of the DT Williamson design put into production. The first of the Williamson published schematics was in 1947. There was a 1949 update. And in 1950, Heathkit came out with the W1. And then by 1958, they had successfully put in 7 total revisions or 6 total revisions to make a W7. But they were originally all the same DT Williamson design, but then they just, as you'll see, they tweaked them along the way. The first one here was the Heathkit W1. You'll see here where this chassis is the power supply. There's the power transformer, there's the choke, the rectifier, some capacitors, all mounted on a chassis, umbilical cord connecting over here to what is the audio chassis with the output transformer, output tubes, push-pull, driver tubes, more capacitors. That's the W1. And you'll note here, these are 807 output tubes with plate caps. There's the schematic for the power supply, and it's about as simple as you're going to get. You know, there's a line cord, power transformer, 5 volts to run the rectifier tube, which is a 5V4. Down here's a 6-volt winding to run the heaters for the rest of the amplifier. And then here's your high voltage winding, which is a full wave center tap that feeds into the rectifier. And then your simple basic pi filter with a capacitor, choke, capacitor. That's it. We're done. That's the whole power supply. And that's pretty much what they use for all the rest of the designs as well. This is the W1 schematic. And here's where the power supply comes across. But let's start over here. Here's where your audio signal would come in. They put a capacitor there, and obviously then with the input resistor, it forms a filter so that it would block, you know, rumble and, you know, turntable noise and things. But there's your input to a voltage amplifier, a little triode that does some voltage amplifying. And it's got directly connected to the grid of a phase splitter, which that plate resistor and that cathode resistor would be equal size resistors, which would then create a positive going wave up on this side and a negative going wave on this side through coupling capacitors into a driver tube. Or, yeah, this is one single tube, but it's like a 6SN7. So 1/2 of the 6SN7 would be doing 1/2, and the other half would go to the other half. Then it would go through coupling capacitor again into the output section. And the output was a push-pull with a center tap. You know, here's your typical output transformer for center tap. There's the 807 plate cap connection on both sides. One thing to note here is that there's a resistor that connects the screen grid to the plate connection, and that's the same on both sides. So effectively, they were running this 807 tube as a triode. That's a small value resistor, so the screen grid and the plate were at the same value roughly, and it was not contributing to any power output through the transformer. So this was not very powerful. Down here, you're going to see this is like a test point, and here's another test point. And then this is a cathode bias system that they have with an adjustment pod, so that you could actually adjust. What you could do is measure here at these 2 points and then adjust the amount of resistance that one tube had over the other tube, so that you could set the idle current of each of the output tubes at the same level. And it worked fine. It was a little bit odd trying to put the probes in these positions, but it worked, and it worked fine. And I haven't heard an awful lot of people complain about it, although they said that you could have done a better design. Personally, I think it's fine. I owned one of these, and I thought it worked just fine. So what was this? That was a two chassis design. The output transformer was made by Peerless, which is an excellent transformer. It was that triode connection for the output tube, and made this a 5-watt amplifier. Not exactly high powered, but in 1950, that was considered okay. But if you think about it, a pair of 807 output tubes configured as 5 watts of output, wow, you could do a lot better, or a lot more output with a pair of 807s. The exposed plate cap connection had 400 some odd volts on it, so obviously this was not something you wanted to have the dog's tail scraping across in your room. But if you look at it, it was simple, it was easy to build, and Heathkit started selling quite a few of these. Then the next year, they decided to make some changes, and they came up with the Heathkit W2. You could see here the the power supply looks pretty much the same. In fact, most people will state that the W1, the W2, and the W3 all have the same power supply. I personally have found that the choke has a different number on it depending on which one you own, but electrically they're the same. One thing you will note here is that the audio chassis looks a little bit different. It looks a little bit different for the output transformer and a little bit different for the power tubes. Here is the audio chassis for the W2, and the front part of it's all pretty much the same. One thing you'll notice here in the output section that's different is that you obviously you have 5881s here. You don't have a plate cap on these tubes. You've got a 5881, which again is a 6L6 type tube, and the 807 actually is very similar to a 6L6 type electrically. They're just physically different. So they didn't really change the idea that that's the sound that they wanted, but they used a much smaller tube that had less total power dissipation capability. But then they turned around and made this connection. From the screen grid, they now have a connection that goes to the transformer, and this transformer is now an ultralinear transformer. And by putting that ultralinear transformer in and connecting these screen grids out, it now made a big difference to the performance of the W2. Same power supply, same grade chassis, but it used different output tubes, and it used another Peerless output transformer, but it was ultralinear. But the big difference is it went from 5 watts to 20 watts of output, and just by changing that so that you could use the ultralinear transformer. Well, not to be outdone, another year later, they came out with the W3. You'll notice here the power supply pretty much looks the same as it did before. They now have a gold chassis. And here's the audio chassis. And they still have the 5881s, but they have a very different looking output transformer. Now, the W3 used the same power supply, that used the same 5881s, but they wound up going to Acrosound, and they purchased TO300 output transformers instead of using the Peerless output transformers. It still gave you the same 20 watts per channel, but they also gave you the option as to whether or not you want a gold or a gray chassis. Not an awful lot of changes, but realistically, the Acrosound TO300 has gotten to better reviews through the many years than the Altec or the Peerless. Although the Peerless it was a great transformer, the Acrosound TO300 was considered a better transformer. So each step that they're going through is supposedly a little bit better, although quite frankly, all three of these are very nice. Well, another year later, they came out with another design, and this one is the W4. Now, this one was changed, obviously, because we no longer have two chassis. We have one chassis. We got one big power transformer in the middle. You still got your rectifier. You still got your choke and your filter for your power supply. So the concept behind the power supply really didn't change. And if you look at the 6SN7s and the 5881s and the output transformers, that really didn't change. It's just that it's all on one chassis, which made it a little more convenient, and you didn't have an umbilical cord trying to connect those things all together. But you'll notice there's no beautiful Acrosound TO300 here. This is just another black chassis transformer, and I think they got them from Chicago Transformer at that point, but I'm not positive of the vendor. But they were all very nice looking black. It was the first of the single chassis, same tubes, same gold and gray chassis. Okay, it was a Chicago Transformer, and it's the same 20 watts of output. It's generally considered that the W4 is a little bit stepped down from the W3, even though it makes it nicer to have one single chassis. The output transformer was no match for the W3's use of the Acrosound. So this, in looking back on it, was not as desirable as the earlier versions, but it really is a nice looking amp and it worked fine, and there's really nothing wrong with W4s. So then we come along to the next year. They came out with the W5. Now this one was kind of a very different looking unit. The chassis was a little deeper. You still had the power supply transformer, the choke, the rectifier, the different rectifier, and capacitor here. Made a very similar power supply to, but there is a different rectifier. Then you'll notice here, we've got some miniature tubes. And if I'm not mistaken, they're 12AU7s in place of the 6SN7s. Then also here, they use some Genelex KT66 output tubes, and then another Peerless output transformer. So this, and then right here, you'll notice a hole right there and here, and one back in each corner. That was to put the cover on. These actually were meant to put a cover over the top. The first 4 models of the Heathkit Williamson had no covers. The W5 was the first one with a cover. So gold chassis only, got rid of the gray. The first version with the protective cover. They went back to the Peerless output transformer, but it was a different one. They actually had 2 different transformer versions. The Genelex KT66 were really great tubes, so that was a good thing to move to. And it used these new miniatures, the 12AU7s, and they worked fine. But they also went to a 5R4 rectifier instead of the 5V4, a little bit more beef to it. And by doing so, they upgraded it to 25 watts of output over the 20 watts that we've been seeing previously to some of the earlier versions. Not to be outdone, another year later, they come out with the W6. Now this, you'll notice there's no rectifier tube. This was the first of putting diodes in and creating, and also there's no quad cap sticking up. There was capacitors underneath, but it still had a very similar power supply design. It's just that it used diodes underneath. Output transformer. I'm sorry, this is the output transformer. That would be the power transformer. And these tubes were then similar, but a little bit different, where they had a driver tube, but it's still electrically very similar. In fact, I think we got a schematic for it coming up. And these were 6550 output tubes, so that they were really a much more powerful amplifier. A meter in the front. So this is a very different looking design than what they had before. And here is the schematic for it, and you'll see that they've got, the voltage amplifier in the beginning, phase splitter, and then a driver here, and then really a whole nother driver section before it went into the 6550s. So this, and still doing the ultralinear. Once they went to ultralinear, they stayed with it. So there's a whole nother section of gain, and they needed to do that to drive the 6550s, because right down here, they've upgraded it all the way to 70 watts, because this was in the middle of that power amplifying struggle with all the other manufacturers, and they were trying to go more and more power. But they kept it as gold chassis only, peerless output transformers. But you could use either the Genelex KT88s or the 6550s, which were made in this country. But it did use an additional section to drive the output tubes. It used solid state rectification. Oh, and it eliminated the choke. I'm sorry, I missed that here. There was no choke. So, but it, we'll move on to the last one another year later. This was the last of the Williamson designs. And quite frankly, in my opinion, it really isn't even a Williamson design. It's the W7. Obviously, the chassis is thinner compared to the W6 and the W5. Kind of an unusual look where they've got the tubes set down into the chassis with capacitors there. I mean, it's just a very different look. And here's a single tube for the front end where you got a power transformer and an output transformer, but it just definitely looks very different than the earlier versions. And here's the W7. And the reason I don't really like this called a Williamson design is that that's a pentode right there. That's not a triode. And that does the voltage amplification. And when it's got a capacitor coupled to a grid of a triode, which then does the phase splitting, and that drives the output tubes, which are configured as ultralinear as well. But the voltage amplifier here is a pentode, and because of that, it's definitely, in my opinion, not really a Williamson design. But look at that design right there. We're going to look at that a little bit further in the rest of the program. But this, by having a simple single tube right here and having these nice EL34 output tubes, was able to get 55 watts of output. So they stayed with the gold chassis only. They had end bells on those transformers. They didn't have the nice big mounted transformers. It used EL34 output tubes, which are very good tubes, and it made 55 watts of output. It retained the solid state rectifiers. There was no choke, but it's not a classic Williamson. The layout is similar to the Dynaco driver, but a bit more complex. So that effectively ends the Heathkit portion of this, but those 7 amplifiers did really help Heathkit a lot. People liked those amplifiers, they bought them, they used them for many years. The hi-fi industry, even today, looks at those and says, those were good products. Those were good products. So we move on to the second half of the companies. Oops, I did it again. This was Dynaco. Now, Dynaco was really a guy named Dave Hafler, met this guy named Ed Laurent, and they joined forces in 1955 after Dave Hafler left his previous job. And in October of 1955, they started a company called Dynaco. They had to sell something, so they came up with an amplifier, and it was they made it the Mark II, a 50-watt amp, and they made it as a kit. They made very few. I didn't know if I said this, but Heathkit really pretty much sold only those amplifiers as kits. They really didn't sell them as finished products. Dynaco came out and said, let's gonna compete in the kit market. So they really put out all of their products to begin with as kits. They sold the Mark IIs for a while, then they came out with the Mark IIIs. You're gonna see some of that in a few minutes. They designed some other amplifiers. Probably the most one that they're most noted for is the Stereo 70, which was a stereo amp, whereas these Mark series were monophonic power amplifiers. They sold more than 350,000 of the ST70 power amplifiers over their production run. And that made it the most popular amplifier ever made. And quite frankly, I still think that, and I listen and I look at the advertisements all the time, no other manufacturer has ever made that many of the same amplifiers ever. Now you could go through and say, gee, Pioneer makes a lot of amplifiers, Yamaha makes a lot of amplifiers, but they don't make the same amplifier. Whereas Dynaco made the same amplifier, and they made 350,000 of them. That to me is a very big deal, not only then, but today, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. They made a number of different products, tuners, speakers. They started making solid state equipment. They made a lot of different things, but then they got sold off to Tyco, and then Hafler stayed on for a while, and then in 1977 he started his own business. He left and wound up going off. Actually, it was before 77. He went off to run his own business called the Hafler Company. And then ultimately, Dynaco was really shut down in 1977, and that was the end of it. So they lasted from 1955 to 1977. They sold the name off. The name's been banded around, and people have picked it up and tried to put it in. But when people talk about vintage Dynaco, they're talking about all the products that were made from 1955 to 1977. The newer products, even though they're okay, are just very different. A quick word on their preamps and tuners. The Dynaco PAM1 was the first preamp in 1957. It used an umbilical cord, just like the Heathkits. Then a little bit later, they come out with the PAS2 preamp, which was a stereo amp and preamp in 1960. They came up with an FM tuner in 1961 called FM1, and then they added a multiplexer to it in 1964 and called it the FM3. And then they came out with the Dynaco PAS3X preamp in 1960. Right after the PAS2, this got to be, most people know the PAS3 and the 3X as the primary ones, not the 2, but they're very popular. And they sold an awful lot of the preamps. Dynaco amplifiers. Mark II was started when they first went into business in October of 1955. 2 years later, they came out with the Mark III, which when you first look at it, it looks like the same thing, but there's some definite differences, which we'll go over. And in 1959, they came out with the Stereo 70, so it was a stereo amp rather than a mono amp. And they also came out with the Mark IV the same year. The Mark IV is basically half of a Stereo 70. The Stereo 70 has a single power supply and 2 individual audio section channels. The Mark IVs were power supply and that same audio amplification section, and you would just buy 2 of these individual Mark IVs to have stereo. Then in 1963, they came out with the Stereo 35, which is a smaller version of the Stereo 70. It used it was just miniature. You'll see pictures of it in a few minutes. Then in 1964, they came out with the SCA 35, which was SCA was stereo. I'm not sure what the letters are, but it's an integrated amplifier. It's got the preamplifier and the power amplifier together. All the rest of these were strictly power amplifier units. This particular model had controls as well as the amplification section. And then the very last thing they did was called the Mark VI, and it came out in 1976, which was really kind of a shame because this was their largest and most powerful amplifier. And it came out in 1976, and they really shut down the doors of the business in 1977. So there was really not an awful lot of these Mark VIs made, but these were 120 watts a channel, so that was pretty cool. Dynaco amplifiers. They all had Ed Laurent's simple layout. He's the one that, there's a lot of people that think that Ed did the original design of the circuit. Many people think it was Dave Haefler. I'd like to give both of them the same credit. They really started the company at the same time. I know that Ed Laurent worked on it as lead engineer, and Haefler was obviously the guy that ran the business. So you really kind of have to give both of them credit for it. The first section is a pentode voltage amplifier, and the plate is connected directly to the grid of a split load phase inverter. We're going to show you the schematics in a minute. The phase inverter has 2 coupling capacitors connected to the output tubes, which means that there's only 2 coupling caps in the amplifier. That, I think, is a big deal. All output transformers were ultralinear. Dynaco never put out anything other than an ultralinear type output transformer. Some caps were added between stages and then overall for feedback. Different amps had different cap values, and you'll see that in some of the schematics. They were tweaking it is what they were doing. The larger amps used a fixed bias supply, and the smaller output tube cathode resistors used for voltage sensing. This was a big deal, in my opinion. We're going to go through that on the drawing, and it really made a lot of sense. And the smaller amps, the ST35 and the SCA 35, were cathode biased, and there's no adjustability to them. So the bigger amps were much more adjustable, and they were a simple way to do the biasing, which I'll show you in a minute. Here is one of the original Dynaco Mark IIs, and I'm going to call it original because what you're going to see here is they used a circuit board and mounted it on the chassis. This one is a fairly wide board, and that's an indication that this amplifier was built in the early run. This would have been 1955 or maybe 1956. There was some changes after that. Transformers were always mounted over here. The output tubes were always mounted here, rectifier there, and the quad capacitor sitting there. Okay, I have two schematics for this, and normally you only show a schematic because it's the one that the company issued. Well, that's really difficult with the Mark II because this one was always listed as the early Mark II schematic. And it was indicative, it's the one that actually came in the amplifiers that I own. So it has a pentode voltage amplifier right here. And then the plate is connected directly to the grid of the triode. And then that resistor and that resistor are equal values, so that this one will amplify one half of the waveform. This cathode side will do the other half. There's your only coupling capacitors driving the output section, which then has an ultralinear transformer feeding the load. And you'll notice here that there's common 8 and 16 ohms. This is the A430 output transformer. There is no 4 ohm tapped. Now, the power supply is fairly simple, and it's kind of like the Heathkits. You got, on off switch. You've got 5 volts for the rectifier, and this is a 5U4 rectifier. And you've got a 6 volt heaters to run these 6 volt tubes up here. But what you also have here is there's a tap right here, a winding that comes off and comes down through here. There's a diode here, which in the originals these were selenium rectifiers, but most people put in a diode like a 1N407 that does the same thing. It's just a diode. And then a series of resistors, including this adjustment pot and that resistor going to ground. And this is your bias supply. Very simple. 3 resistors to ground. It drops a little voltage, gets it to an adjustment pot, and then the rest of the voltage drop to ground. That voltage, the tap point goes from there to there, and it comes up. And now you've got this capacitor going to ground. Now, the one thing you'll notice is this is not correctly labeled. That is a negative power supply, and it got this capacitor shown with the positive towards here. It is actually the positive is on this side going towards ground, which gives you a negative power supply, which then comes up and biases the 2 output tubes. This simple bias system has proven itself for all the time that I've dealt with hi-fi equipment. This is the simplest, easiest, and best working system that's out there. You can change the resistors. If they start getting bad or getting old or have problems, the pot can be changed out, but the concept behind it is just so simple and straightforward. It just always works. Very stable. So there's the amp. Now you've got some feedback this way. You've got some other, let me see if I can find some other, here's another feedback cap here. These are the things that are tweaks that you'll see differences on some of the other amplifiers. So there's the first schematic. Now notice right here, there's no other connection. Here's the next schematic. This is the one that's in the published manual that Dynaco put out. And basically it's the same thing, except if you look carefully, let me see if I can find it. Right here, this is the power supply. There's a connection with a capacitor that comes in and comes right to this point right here. So they added this 25 picofarad capacitor, and they did that very early on, but not so early that it made it onto the circuit board, because I'm going to go back a little bit. Whoops, too far. Right here, there is no place to put that capacitor. It doesn't exist. So these amplifiers were sold without being able to put that capacitor. Well, I mean, you can jumper it across, but there is no place in the lineup that they put there for that capacitor. So, but that's what's in the manual. But the rest of it is all the same. So we'll move on. There's the Dynaco Mark III. That came out 2 years later. And when you first look at it with the power transformers here and the circuit board, output tubes, the rectifier, and the, why, it's the same thing, isn't it? Now, when you look carefully, you'll see that there is some very major differences. One is, notice that the width of the circuit board is narrower through here. The earlier version, the circuit board came out much closer to the transformer. The tubes are different. The chassis is different. And we're going to go through some of those. But it's pretty much the same size and shape. So a lot of people mistake them for each other. There's the schematic for the Mark III. And when you look at the beginning in all of this stuff, it's the same thing. But you're going to see that that 25 picofarad capacitor has now been changed to a 12 picofarad capacitor. All the rest of the values are the same over here. And here, instead of using EL60A7 output tubes, they use 6550 or KT88 output tubes, a little bit bigger, a little more power. Same type of biasing supply down here. Same power supply, except that this is now a GZ34 rectifier tube instead of a 5U4. All these may not sound like a big deal, but they are. The other big deal is underneath that you couldn't see in the other photo. This was a resistor on the Mark II, and it's now a choke on the Mark III. So there's some refinements that were made in the 2 years between the two models. Oh, I was hoping that I had a list of changes. Darn it. All right, one of the other things that I'm going to pop back and look at the view. Notice the plating on this, and the plating looks like chrome, and it's actually not, it's nickel. They bent the metal and then they had them dipped, and that was a nickel finish. We're going to go back a couple more, back to the Mark II. That's actually cadmium plating, not nickel plating. It looks more like it's painted, but it's not. It's not paint, it's cadmium. And you'll notice this has the cover on it already, and the cover sits down below the chassis. And that the top cover, which is not shown here, goes over the outside edge right here. This, you'll notice there's a little slit right here, and that's because this piece of metal right here is actually part of the bottom cover. So it comes down, goes underneath, and comes back up the other side so that it looks like this. So that when you look at one of these amplifiers from the kind of an angle view, you'll see the front is nice and smooth, and it comes around and it's nice and smooth here, and the cover fits over it, and the cover sits down in that slot right there. So it's much neater, trimmer, definitely some improvements to the Mark III compared to the Mark II. The Stereo 70. This is the one that everybody, when you think of Dynacos, this is the amplifier that people tend to want to own and buy and maintain. It's the same height chassis as some of the other bigger amps. It's got the the nice plating on the chassis. Well, power transformer sits in the middle, left channel here, right channel here. Here's your outputs. And if you look at the circuit board, it's symmetrical, with this being the right-hand side feeding this way, left-hand side feeding that way. Power supply is through here with the rectifier tube and the quad cap there, all making that simple power supply. The feed for the into the amp comes through the front, and your test points will be here, which we'll get into in a minute. So there's the schematic for it, and if you zoom in on it, you'll find that here again it's that same circuit where you got a pentode voltage amplifier directly coupled to a phase splitter. two output coupling capacitors feeding into output tubes, ultralinear. And this has 4, 8, and 16 ohm taps. What I didn't say on the Mark III was it has a 4 ohm tap. The early Mark IIs did not have that 4 ohm tap. So now there's obviously here the dotted line shows you the circuit board, and it basically has both of the audio amplification circuits, and then the output sections are sitting on either side to the outside. You know, we could go through the power supply here, but it's still pretty much the same thing with the simple power supply, a choke, and then feeding into the amplifier. And here is that Mark IV. This is half of a Stereo 70. Power transformer, the choke and the GZ34 rectifier, output transformer, EL34 output tubes, and a small circuit board, but basically it's the same circuit board. It's got the same components as the Stereo 70. A little better view of it, but you know, if you look carefully at the schematics, it's really the same thing. There is some minor differences in places where you've got, like, there's a feedback capacitor there, there's a resistor over here. All of these are really minor differences, and I think it's just a way of the factory trying to tweak a few things here and there that made them different between the different amplifiers. But quite frankly, they're pretty much the same design throughout. So then we moved on to the Mark VI. This is the one that came out in 1976 and was only in production for a year. This is a behemoth. It's heavy. I know, because I have to carry mine around occasionally, and it's big. It used, here's the schematic for it. It's got the same driver section as the others, but you'll notice here there's 4 output tubes. These are 8417 output tubes. So you've got twice as many output tubes as there were in, let's say, the Mark IIIs. So instead of 60 watts a channel, this thing will do 120 watts a channel. But it's a little more complex. Here's a meter. You know, if you go back one here, you'll see there's a meter here sitting in the front. This meter will give you how much output there is, and if you switch some of the stuff around, you can actually measure the biasing to see what kind of current's in the output, or how much output current there, or the idling current there is. So more complex, but if you took that earliest amplifier and laid them out right next to it, you'd find, oh, a little bit here, a little bit there is different. Not an awful lot, though. This did use diodes here. So there's no rectifier tube here, but it still uses capacitor, choke, capacitor to make a pi filter. It did use, it's a 6N030. It's a time delay relay that basically it picks up after 30 seconds and puts the power to the front end. So it does not let the power get to the front end until that relay picks up. But here's that same basic bias circuit again, diode, and then resistors to ground, and then that feeds in here to the output section. Very straightforward. Now, this thing's got different ways of connecting for the different places in the world where they sell them, 220 volt, 240 volts. That was not available in the earlier amplifiers, but it is in this one. This is the ST35. This is the little brother to the ST70. Much smaller and very compact. That's a good thing and a bad thing, but you'll still see it does circuit boards on both sides. 1 power transformer, 2 output transformers, and a quad capacitor sitting right there. people really like these things. These are a little bit smaller versions of the transformers than the bigger amps, and yet they're the same quality level and very nice sounding products. You'll notice these tubes are miniature type. These are EL84 or 6BQ5 tubes, and that tube right there is a 7247. It's not a pentode voltage amplifier, which we'll see in a second. It's actually a triode. I don't know if you could see this. Oh, this is not showing up very well. Sorry. But this again, it's a voltage amplifier here feeding directly into a phase splitter, but that's a triode, not a pentode. They didn't need an awful lot of voltage to drive these EL84 output tubes, but pretty much the same idea where you're going to have an input voltage amplifier, phase splitter, coupling capacitors. There's only the two driving the EL84 output tubes, ultralinear power output transformer and out. But this one does use diodes. The little amps did use diodes that rather than put in a big rectifier tube, but it's still, and then they used a capacitor, but then they used a resistor and another capacitor to make the pi filter. So they cheapened it up a little bit, but that was one of their goals, was to make a small amp that was more affordable for people. The power transformer tends to run a little hot, but you could see it's jammed in there next to the output transformers. But they're very durable, dependable. They work fine. People really like these things a lot. So nice products. This is the SCA 35. This is basically a combination of part of their PAS 3X preamp with the selector switch, the volume, the different controls for blending it, the bass, treble, along with the ST35 power amplifying section, all wrapped up in one container. That made this a very versatile product. It was inexpensive. It was my very first amplifier, was one of these. And they worked fine. They're nice products. Oh, did I hit too many? No? Okay. So basically that covers all of the different amplifiers from Dynaco. And I just wanted to bring up a few things here that under references, if you do search on these, both companies have good historical info. There's a place called Nostalgia Kit Central where Heath has got a list of a lot of audio equipment there. Chuck Person's book is called Heathkit HiFi and Stereo Products. He wrote it and put it out in 2018. Highly recommended. That's a great product. There's a book written by Bruce. I'm not sure how you pronounce that, but that's a nice product to read about it. There is a tube forum. If you go to Dynaco Tube Audio, there's a forum out there, and I belong to the forum. They've got a lot of really knowledgeable people that can help you with Dynaco products and some of the newer products that are made like Dynaco's. Very knowledgeable people, very helpful. There's a company called tubesforhifi.com, and they basically make Dynaco clone products. And I guess I'm going to make a little quick comment here that they actually make like a Stereo 70 where the chassis is the same size and shape as the original. It actually has a cover that fits the same. It's laid out the same. I mean, they're really trying to make it like a Dynaco, but they're brand new transformers, brand new chassis. There is nothing old about it. It's all brand new products, and they have a warranty on these products. And you can build them as kits, or you can have these people make those amps for you and just buy them. There's another company called DynakitParts.com, and they have an awful lot of parts that are unique to Dynaco that are important. and you can get them there. Now, lately, I've been finding they're out of stock on a number of things, but if you're stuck and you need to fix something that's Dynaco and you need a part, I'd try there first just to see if they have it in stock. Today, oops, I do that. Don't do that. Today, all vintage amplifiers are in demand. In other words, anything from the golden age of hi-fi, whether it's H.H. Scott, Macintosh, Dynaco, whomever, people really like these things. But most of the manufacturers out of business, or they've changed so much, like Macintosh, let's say, they've changed so much that they no longer support the old equipment. So you're kind of on your own. Heathkit, unfortunately, was noted for having power transformer failures. They purchased an awful lot of their transformers from Chicago Transformer, and they had a lot of power transformer failures. The good news is that they sold so many of these that you can still buy a transformer off of eBay or some other place, but you may have to wait around until somebody puts one up for sale. But that you can keep these old things going, but you have to work at it a little bit. Dynaco has the strongest support and the most number of companies making new parts for the original specs. And I'm going to make a comment here that when you go back and you look and find that Dynaco made 350,000 of the same stereo 70s is the reason why there's such a strong support, because so many people have the same amplifier. And if you need a part, many people need the same part. So there's an awful lot of companies making parts and pieces that will fit in the Dynacos and their exact specs, same thing. And it's nice that we can get that kind of support. You may have to look, you may have to figure out where to go look, but Dynaco of all of them has the best support of any of them. The Williamson design has been superseded with all kinds of new computer-aided drivers that today people go out and do a lot with trying to make better driver circuits. But, you know, if you listen, I've listened to the old Heathkit Williamsons, and they sound pretty darn good. So how much better are the new circuits? Maybe they're better. But if you've got an old Heathkit Williamson, W2, W3, W5, they're pretty good. So don't get rushing off just to buy something new because it's, quote, better. These old amps were pretty good. The Dynaco driver design was always considered an item to be improved upon. I've been reading about this for 50 years, and yet I still feel it's very simple and it has some advantages because it has less parts. And one of the things that I do with my equipment is I replace all the capacitors and all the resistors. When you put in new parts in these old pieces of equipment, you basically have a really nice new sounding amplifier. And Dynacos sound very good. And so do the Heathkits, so I'm not going to knock them down. Today, the heavy chassis, because these were beautiful big old chassis, the transformers and lots of room inside them, make these amps really desirable. If you've ever opened up a new digital analog converter that you just bought and took a look inside, you'd be like, oh my God, you can't fix that thing. You buy it, you use it, you throw it out if it's broke. But these old pieces of equipment were built in an era when you could take things apart, fix them, put them together. And because they were done as kits, they had to have the room for people that were maybe a little ham-handed to be able to put them all together and make them work. And it really pays big dividends today that you still can go in and fix all these things because they have plenty of room to work. If you've got one, enjoy it, fix it, restore it, and make it work.
Please like and subscribe to this channel and press the bell icon to get new video updates.